Disclaimer: this is audio horror fiction. If darkness or the creatures it holds scares you, leave now. Still listening? Good. Then let's begin. I remember the day I found out Viola was pregnant, and it was the happiest moment of my life. I only wish it had been hers too. I have to get rid of it. She paced across the kitchen in quick steps, one arm wrapped tightly under her breast with the test clutched in her fist, and the other hand pulling at her hair. "Why, sweetie?" I pleaded, trying to pull her into my arms. "Let's talk about this. We can do this. You can do this." She didn't turn to me or respond. Her eyes fixed to the ground as she paced. Her curls began to lose their bounce as she raked her nails through her hair and tugged harder on the ends. Soon anxiety would find its way to her teeth and she'd start biting on her hands. I grabbed her shoulders and forced her to face me, as gently as possible, of course. "What are you scared of? We've got the house. Money's good. I could work the extra hours for the cash in the first few months. Your job has a great maternity package." The reasons ran out of my mouth as to why we shouldn't panic about this. "I'd be a horrible mother. I have no patience for crying and babies and all that crap." Her eyes darted away from mine, refusing contact, and she brought her hand to her mouth, the nail of her index finger scratching at her lip while her eyes jumped about the room. "And I like my job. I'm good at my job. I don't want to be yet another woman and throw away a career for children." I tried to look at her, ducking down and bringing my head level with hers. "I could work from home after the first few months. I could be a stay-at-home dad." "No!" Her shout came with her flash of anger, slapping my arms away as she walked away, shutting herself in the bedroom. I wasn't lying when I said I'd stay at home. I've wanted children with her since the day we were married, but always waited. The conversations we had went round and round, but what it ultimately came down to was that the concept terrified Viola, specifically childbirth and pregnancy. She even tried to convince me we should adopt instead. "Think of all those poor children who don't get nice families. We can help them instead." It was a deflection, a way to twist the argument so I'd end up sounding like an asshole. She was good at that, so simply it was easier to leave the conversation there. I feel guilty now, looking back. Maybe I pushed her too hard. Maybe I was unfair. We saw the doctor the next day and found that Viola was already 9 weeks along, which gave us 3 weeks to make the decision. The doctor was very kind, explained all the risks for both abortion and pregnancy. We spent an hour in that office going back and forth, Viola trying to pick her brain of every reason not to, the doctor dismissing many of the urban myths and horror stories she had heard while looking at his watch between each break in conversation. In the end, we decided to keep it, though it didn't feel like Viola decided at all. She seemed more defeated than decided. I did all the things I could think to reassure her it would be alright. Worked extra hours at home for the money, but not to be away from her. Took her out shopping for things for the baby. Argued baby names in front of the TV. She said Thaddeus was a graceful name. I thought it was weird and old-fashioned. Sarah was too popular for her. It was my mother's name. In the end, the names never mattered to me, nor the gender, or who they would grow up to be. All I wanted was to bring a child into the world with my beautiful wife. I thought everything would be alright at the start of the second trimester. Viola may still have been anxious during the scans, constantly worried there might be something wrong with the baby, but when she managed to get distracted from these thoughts, she did begin to seem excited. The living room became the baby's strategy room. Magazines for cots and prams, color charts for the nursery. She said blue because it will help the baby sleep, and scowled at me for asking, well, what if it was a girl? Books lent from friends about what to eat, drink, and do while pregnant. However, as her belly grew, so did Viola's anxiety. While I lovingly stroked the bulge of her stomach at night, she glared at it by day, sometimes digging her fingers into it with harsh pokes. "There's something wrong with this baby." She didn't raise her head from her stomach as she lay on the sofa, prodding the swell. "Stop that." I pulled her hand away. "What's wrong?" We had only just had a scan a week before, and many more regularly due to her concerns. The nurse smiled and said everything was fine, don't worry. As the weeks went on and Viola got more insistent something was wrong, the nurse's smiles faded and turned to nods and a curt, "You're fine." "There's something wrong. I feel like rot on the inside." She scowled at her stomach as if trying to see into her own womb. The nurses are lying. This was the beginning of the descent. Viola had suffered from depression before I'd met her, so I wasn't as shocked as maybe I should have been at the time. I tried to ask the doctors if she could take something, just to help her stop worrying so much. But apparently anti-anxiety medication, or any medication for that matter, can adversely affect the pregnancy. He recommended therapy and she was assigned to a waiting list. We never heard from a therapist in the remaining weeks. Viola began to act more and more paranoid. Something wrong with the baby. The doctors are liars. She was consistently agitated and anxious. Many times I found myself pulling her hand from her teeth before she drew blood, and pushing a pin into her hand to chew on instead. She slept badly, if at all, waking up, screaming. "The rot is inside me, Tony. It's eating me alive. There's something wrong with this baby. It's not alone in there," she would whisper with a wild look in her eyes, before they rolled back and she fell asleep again. I sat open-mouthed at my sleeping wife. What nightmares and delusions is she having, and why can't I do a damn thing to stop it? I pleaded with the doctor for something. However, he reinforced therapy, sending another recommendation. It was maddening to hear this bullshit and go home the same night to see Viola waddling through the kitchen, her arm across her, fist clenched, and pulling at her hair. These moments at the time made me impressed at how she managed to recover from her depression previously, considering waiting lists of therapy treatments. Viola barely even attended her own baby shower. She came down and sat with the guest, while her mother buzzed around passing her presents and serving cups of tea. Only half an hour later, when her workmates were giggling and suggesting names or guessing genders, Viola snapped, "Out! Out! All of you, out!" She hurried herself upstairs, leaving the silent room behind her. During the third trimester, her condition only got worse. Luckily, my manager at work allowed me to work from home for the last few months. I'm sure it'll all be better once the baby is born. I pulled a smile across my face while my eyes itched and the weight of sleep deprivation pulled on all my limbs. At this point, she began to wander during the night. The sleepless pacing seemed harmless at first, until one night I awoke to the sound of metal crashing on ceramic tiles. I had already jumped out of bed and was halfway down the stairs before my brain could process what I was responding to. Viola stood in the center of the kitchen, limply holding a wooden drawer from the kitchen cabinet in her hand, surrounded by knives on the floor. It was a wonder she hadn't cut herself. "Viola, what are you doing?" My breath froze in my lungs and she lifted her head to me with sleep pink eyes. "I have to stop it, Tony." She dropped the drawer, it falling only an inch away from her feet onto the carpet of knives next to her. "Stop what?" I tiptoed across the cold tiles and around the blades and took my wife by the arm. Her arm was cold and ribbed in goosebumps. She stepped towards me, my arms automatically tightening on her to lift her away from the mess of knives below us. She leant forward, her lips to my ears, her belly pressed to mine. Despite the strangeness of the situation, having her lips this close felt romantic and sweet. "I have to get it out. I have to get it away from the baby." I set her back in bed, cleaned up the knives, and then joined her. She had already fallen asleep as I pulled myself under the covers. Running my hand over her stomach, I hoped I would somehow find something. Somehow find some secret to make everything clear. Then I could make everything better. But there was just her soft, smooth skin under my fingertips. It must have been a week before she was due when I had to have her admitted. I had a strange dream. Nothing sinister, just surreal. I was at work with my boss, and I'd been assigned a new project. Despite the fact it was only my manager and I in the room, there were a dozen or more glasses of water on the table between us. He talked on and on about the new project, some web design for a celebrity nutritionist whose show was full of crap, figuratively and literally. I dozed off to his words, a strange feeling in a dream, when I noticed the water in the glasses rippling. As my eyes focused on the ripples, I started to notice the sound, a slow thump with each new set of ripples. My manager seemed not to notice even as the sound grew and grew. At some point, my mind managed to separate dream from reality, and I realized the thumping sound was coming from behind me. I flicked the light on next to me and rolled over to see Viola sitting up on the bed, swinging back and forth, hitting her head against the wall. It wasn't the small, exasperated action you might do when the day isn't going well. Her whole body rocked back and flung her forehead forwards into the wall, leaving a few spots of blood behind. I leapt up and grabbed her by the shoulders, trying to pull her back. As soon as my hands touched her shoulders, she started screaming and scratching at my wrists. I almost let go until I saw the bloody purple bruise across her head, and instead dragged her back to the end of the bed. "Viola, stop this!" She just kept scratching and screaming. I had to just leave her to call 999, and as soon as I picked up the phone, I could hear the repeating thuds again. Each thud was like a blow to my own head while I left her. I managed to explain to the dispatcher the situation, though I could hear some doubt in their voice. They were asking me ridiculous questions like, "Have you and your wife been fighting recently?" Or, "Have you had anything to drink?" As if I'd been beating her and I was covering it up. I wanted to reach down the phone and drag the idiot through, show him that she needed help, not bullshit accusations. I bit my anger back and answered each one, urging him for an ETA. The ambulance did come with the police. They sedated her and took her to the hospital, but not before she bit into one of the EMTs. I followed in my car since they refused to let me ride with her despite seeing the condition themselves. After many more questions from the police and doctors, which started with accusing me of domestic abuse and ended in accusing me of neglect for not getting her help, I was free to go. I mostly stayed at the hospital in the last week, managing to do some work off the feeble Wi-Fi while waiting for more news from the doctors. After initially sedating her at our house, she had calmed down, entering a catatonic-like state for the rest of the week. Then the day came for the baby to be born. We never decided on a name. Thaddeus, Sarah, Michael, Lily. I can't bring myself to imagine a name for the child that was born. I try to push the image out of my head, try and pretend we never even tried to have a baby, try and believe we could do it all again. However, it's just too much to push away, too much to not have nightmares about. The doctors never could explain why it happened, and I never got that closure. The baby was still born that day, but it was not a peaceful little corpse Viola delivered. As the doctor lifted the baby from her, it had bloody scratches over its eyes, flesh and aqueous humor on its cheeks, and tiny red ribbons under its prematurely formed nails. They could never explain to me how an unborn infant could scratch its own eyes out, or why. Thank you all so much for listening. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to help feed the dark machine. If you have a story you would like me to read, check the description below.